Well, thank you very much, Baroness Keithley, and it's a pleasure to join you this afternoon or this morning. The fact that we haven't been able to meet for a couple of years, is noted, and it's a pleasure really to be back with some degree of normalcy, coming back into our lives, and certainly coming before the committee is an opportunity to get back to a bit more normality. So I'd just like to use my time actually to reflect on our perspective at the Charity Commission on how the charity sector is emerging from the pandemic. I'd also like just to touch briefly, if I may, on the Commission's response, and also to mention our plans to review the data that we collect about the charity sector. And of course, it would be remiss of me also not to mention the Charities Bill, which is currently in the House of Lords, as you will all know. What I'd like to do is by starting to focus on the charities themselves. And I would say that the pandemic has highlighted just how tightly charity is woven into the very fabric of our communities and our national life. In the face of national disaster, many charities stepped up to the plate, and visibly so, assisting in our emergency services, tackling poverty, supporting those left lonely and vulnerable. And conversely, the work of some charities became conspicuous by its sudden absence as charitable activity had to cease during lockdown. And that visibility may be having a positive effect on the public trust in charities. Our most recent research indicates that trust and confidence in charities continues to recover after hitting an all-time low 3 years ago. Charities are now among the most trusted groups in society, third only after doctors and the police. And 60% of those asked say that charities play an important or very important role in society, compared to 55% last year. And that increase is certainly very positive to report. But it's set, I believe, against a backdrop of challenges that the sector has really faced over the last 2 years. Over the recent months, we have been undertaking quite a significant project of work to understand how the pandemic has impacted charities so far, and crucially to gain a picture of the risks that may lie ahead. This involved interrogating the data that we already hold, including through the annual returns, reports from auditors, whistleblowers and charities themselves, as well as existing research prepared by charity sector bodies. We also commissioned our own independent research looking at how charities of different sizes perceive the impact of the pandemic on their finances, governance and operations. And I must say that some of the findings were sobering. 70% of the charities we asked told us that they had to change, curtail or halt their work entirely. And smaller charities in particular saw their services severely impacted. 1 in 4 paused their activities completely during the first lockdown. But I would say that the picture is also complex and not as bleak as we might have first feared when the pandemic hit. Certainly, our research points to charities' agility and resilience. Many were quick to adapt and take evasive action during that first lockdown and the sudden loss of income that followed. Many pivoted their work to respond directly to the pandemic, changing the way they delivered services, including by moving them online. And we think that the adoption of digital processes and digital ways of working has really accelerated significantly through the pandemic. And then some charities very much refocused on the core purpose or their core projects, the reasons they were set up in the first instance. Sometimes they clearly had to make very difficult decisions to cut staffing or spend on things, for instance, like research. And others have dipped into their reserves to keep afloat. And throughout the past 18 months, many charities have accessed government support, including the furlough scheme. And we found that over half of the largest charities, so those who had incomes over 500,000, say that they made use of furlough or other emergency funding schemes. I think, in other words, some charities took strong early action in response to unprecedented challenges. And this response may be part of the reason that we have so far seen fewer charities fail and dissolve than we might have predicted back in March last year. So looking ahead, there are some grounds for continued optimism. For example, only 10% of those we asked anticipate that the financial difficulties in the months ahead will present a critical threat to their survival. But the sector's resilience has definitely been tested, and many charities will be less able to weather any further storms. And for some charities, the most difficult times may still lie ahead. So in summary, the sector we regulate is diverse and complex, and COVID continues to have a varied impact depending on what the charity does, its size, and its financial resilience. And this has made it all the more important that the Commission's own response to the pandemic has been flexible and pandemic. We have certainly sought to help trustees navigate the challenges that they've faced. And since March 2020, we've regularly updated easy to find online guidance on responding to some of the common situations that were arising in charities because of the pandemic. And this included guidance, for instance, on the use of reserves to manage financial difficulties and on holding AGMs during periods of restriction. We created a new facility for charities to apply for extensions to their annual reporting requirements, and we granted nearly 5,000 exemptions in total. And we also launched a set of new 5-minute guides which cover the core syllabus we want trustees to know. And we want these guides to be about helping trustees be certain in uncertain times. We do want our online guidance to serve as the first stop for trustees who have questions about running their charity. But there will be times when a trustee needs more bespoke help, when they need to speak to a human being, if you like. So I'm proud of the uninterrupted service our contact centre has provided throughout the pandemic. And during the last financial year, the team fielded around 60,000 calls, supporting over 30,000 charities. We've also continued to hold those to account who breach the rules and betray the trust placed in charities by donors and taxpayers. And last year, we used our regulatory powers on over 2,000 occasions to promote compliance with the law. So this is just a short summary of the Commission's priorities over the last 2 years, but I hope it gives members a flavour of our work, how it's changed, but also what has remained unchanged as we emerge from the pandemic. Looking ahead, I just wanted to touch briefly on our plans for the future regarding data. I'd like to focus in particular on our role in collating and using our data for 3 linked but distinct purposes. First, to ensure that the public has access to information about charities that helps people make informed choices about the charities they want to support. In addition, that government and stakeholders have the information they need to make key decisions. Second, to ensure we hold data and that the data we hold and the information we have enables us to identify risks, trends, and potential problems or wrongdoing in charities. And third, to drive positive behaviour, because we know that reporting drives behaviour. So over the year ahead, we'll begin a fundamental review of the data we collect from charities, and that will include the annual return and charities' annual report and accounts. We'll also review and improve how we make that data work once we hold it. This may ultimately and will ultimately impact on charities quite directly, so we'll make sure that we communicate well with the sector, both with charities directly and with sector bodies, so that we can make sure that the changes we make are beneficial to the public, to policymakers, and of course to the sector itself. And while this work is, I'm certain, going to lead to significant improvements in the way we gather, hold, and use data, many of you will be aware that it's part of a longer journey. And then finally, I just wanted to say that the Commission has obviously been working very closely with the Department for Culture, Digital Culture, Media and Sport and the Law Commission on the passage of the Charities Bill. In short, I think the proposed changes in the bill, whilst fairly technical, should add up to improvements in charity law and make trustees' everyday lives a little bit easier. And of course, that relates to charities in England and Wales. Work is already underway to ensure that we'd be ready to implement the bill when it achieves royal assent, so that those positive changes can be felt early for trustees. So in summary, I just wanted to reflect that no one can really underestimate the challenges of the last 2 years for charities. All of us running organisations, whether in the private, public or voluntary sector, have experienced a year like no other, and the Commission too has had its challenges. However, I believe that the charity sector has been crucial in helping the nation respond to the pandemic and will be crucial in helping it recover. We at the Commission will play our part in ensuring that that can happen. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Helen, for that comprehensive review of what's happened with you and indeed to the sector during the pandemic. I omitted to tell you, although of course you all know that the session is being recorded and there will be a live transcript available. But let us now go straight on to our next speaker, Maureen Mallon, who's the Chief Executive of OSCR. And as you know, we're taking questions after our 3 presentations. So over to you, Maureen.
Thank you. And can I just say how delighted I am to be here representing OSCR and on this fine afternoon. I'm assuming I'm making everybody suitably jealous with the lovely sunshine that's unexpectedly pouring in behind me in sunny Linlithgow. In terms of the areas I want to focus on, what I won't do is go over everything that Helen's already shaped very nicely for us in terms of the overview around what's happening with charities. It's been a very busy, very complex time. And there are very many similarities to what happens for charities across the UK. In terms of that, however, it would be remiss of me not to take this opportunity to not say thank you so much for everything that those charity trustees, staff and volunteers actually do for society. In our view, the charity trustees are society's secret superheroes. So many people don't know of the work they do, and actually society really wouldn't function well without them. If we look at the impact of the pandemic on a few areas here, I wanted to particularly highlight some of the issues that we've had as a regulator. And we're a much smaller organisation for those who aren't aware of us. So we are a staff of 50 people, all of whom were extraordinarily present in an office up until the pandemic hit, and we've moved to online, and we will take incredible lessons from everything that we've had to do in this space. And what we want to do now is to make sure that we particularly move to having many more online meetings and encourage our staff to work from home regularly as we move back into hybrid working. The equity for those trustees, those staff from charities and so on to be able to access our events, our meetings, our seminars in this way, in this online way, by only having to give up an hour as opposed to find themselves coming from all sorts of different parts of Scotland to get to Edinburgh or Glasgow or even Dundee for an hour or so, has meant that we've got a real diversity of people coming to see us, and we really welcome that and we want to hold on to that. One of the things that we did as part of our unique set of circumstances, we do regulate a great deal of very small charities. So one of the things that we've done is bring in a charity reference group, and that group is representative broadly about 40 odd people who come to that meeting, and we make sure that we are really trying to focus on having the voice of the sector coming through from that. It's almost impossible to understand the charity sector for anyone in Scotland. We have 25,000 charities, the vast majority of which are so small they don't even have staff. And if you look at the annual incomes, it's helpful to understand that the 50% around about have an income of less than 25,000. So for those to have the equitable voices can be very difficult. And what we see as very much one of the roles of the regulator is to make sure that people have an understanding of what's going on with the sector, and they're not just hearing the loudest voices who have the opportunity to share those. So we use the data that we have to make sure that people can understand whether they're in national government, local government, UK government, whether they're in academia or in funders, that they can actually genuinely have that understanding of the breadth of what's going on in the charity sector. We are described and describe ourselves as an enabling regulator, and that gives us that healthy balance of looking at what we need to do to make sure that we hold everyone to account, but also what we do is we make sure that we are very much focused on the improvement agenda, bringing in guidance, bringing in seminars, and making sure that charities can do the best they can. Some of the flexibilities that we offered as part of the pandemic, I think, are quite interesting. We offered a grace period for charities who were struggling to hold AGMs and who couldn't get an opportunity to produce their accounts to an additional time. So we gave them that additional time. We were proportionate about people holding online meetings when that wasn't in their governing documents. We really did try and take a common sense approach to much of this. We also allowed very practical things like typed signatures instead of wet signatures, which can sound like a very boring thing, but actually very helpful for people when they weren't able to see each other in person. We made an awful lot of information and guidance as accessible as possible, but we really are conscious that some charities and charity trustees are digitally excluded. And what we try to make sure is that we're reaching out to other organisations through SCVO, through third sector interfaces, through intermediary bodies, through membership bodies, to try to get to as many people as we can with our information. We also specifically prioritised applications on charitable status where organisations were being set up to deal with something that was specifically COVID related, but also to make sure that as people were coming and saying, we need to change our purposes, anything like that was quickly prioritised. As Helen talked about, we also made sure that we really wanted to understand what was going on out in the sector during the pandemic, and we initially took out a very large survey and followed that up later in the year to understand the challenges that charities were facing. That data was extraordinarily well used by a whole range of organisations, Scottish Government, lots of other charity trustees and funders used that data. Lots of national organisations like SCVO, Volunteer Scotland, Social Enterprise Scotland, all used that data to really look and work out how they best targeted their own support and so on. We don't see it as our data and to keep in isolation. And one of the things we really are working on is to make sure that people can access that data and understand the use of that. If we look at the work we do with Scottish Government specifically, one of the things that we do there is we very much work with officials, with MSPs, with other colleagues to say, here is the data, use that to inform the thinking prior to any legislation, prior to anything else. We pride ourselves on being proactive when we see the programme for government coming through and knocking on doors to let people know about the data and the information we have. What we want to do is make sure that everything's the best it can be before it comes out, rather than us having to write back as part of a consultation. Some of the other aspects of specific work during the pandemic, we're really trying to make sure that that we thought about reserves, and we brought out specific guidance, as many others did as well, about how to use that, how to use the reserves, how to be very thoughtful in that. Some charity trustees being very cautious about their use, and some actually wanting to run too fast to spend their reserves because of a need to be helping out there. One of the biggest difficulties we had indeed was actually holding some charities back whose great instinct was to go out and help straight away, and actually asking them to stop, relax, work out what was actually already going on, what other charities and other organisations were already undertaking similar activities in that area before they just jumped in. So that slowly but surely, that thoughtfulness, and then enabling people where they had something real to do. One of the concerns we are taking forward into the next period is really trying to understand where the impacts will happen next around funding. We do know that normal income streams, everybody will be aware that many of these went to the side, and I'll leave to other colleagues who are going to come in shortly to talk about what's been happening in the fundraising world. If we look at what's been happening in the grant making world, one of the things that we really want to encourage people to do is to think about funding in the round, not talk about funding specific and project specific. It's certainly not our role to ask people to spend their money in a certain way, but it is for us to point out that charities need money just as much for electricity bills as they do for particular innovative projects. So that is something that we're highlighting as part of our work over the next period. If we look at our key considerations over the next period, we are working very hard to make reporting as simple as possible. We're bringing in a new online system, and that should help all charities, big and small. We want to make sure that our information continues to be accessible and easy to understand. And we're really focusing in on the charity register and making sure it's as accurate as possible. We're quite worried about dormant charities, charities that took a year out to perhaps see where the land would lie. We want to encourage people to actually celebrate if they're actually recognising that their work is done and they don't want to really get up and running again next year. As Helen highlighted, it's been interesting so far. We haven't seen the drop off of numbers in terms of charities. The charity numbers have remained stable with the same number coming on stream as going off, but we do recognise that it's likely to change in the next year. So what have we learned? Accurate real-time data is really important. We need to make sure that we're always there with the data that people require to understand the charity sector in Scotland. We've recognised that the third sector is adaptable, the resilience is incredible, and the celebration and recognition of charities throughout the pandemic is something to really celebrate. We need to make sure that what we're doing as the regulator is enabling all of that to be recognised and still carrying on with our work. Sorry, I'm trying to make sure I'm putting my little timer off, which is pinging away. We want to make sure that we're still undertaking our work to hold everyone to account as required, undertaking cases as required, highlighting issues and enabling other people to recognise each other's mistakes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maureen, for reminding us of the flexibility and practicality which was necessary during the pandemic and for the lessons learned. Let's go straight on now to hear from Lord Harris, who, as you all know, is the chair of the Fundraising Regulator. And he's going to split the time with Gerald Oppenheim, because I know you have to leave us at some point, Toby. But over to you now.
Thanks very much, Jill. And yes, my apologies that I will have to leave at certainly by 12:30 for a prior appointment. So the Fundraising Regulator, we're different in the sense that we are a self-regulatory body, but we were set up 5 years ago in 2016 following the cross-party review of charitable fundraising that stemmed from, and which you of course were heavily involved, Jill, in the wake of the very bad publicity and media that took place around poor fundraising practice. In particular, the concerns that were raised then about what this would mean in terms of the ethics of fundraising and the way it was conducted. So our work is to promote a culture of ethical and excellent fundraising that both protects donors, but also supports the vital work that charities do day in, day out. In the 5 years since we were set up, I hope we proved that the Fundraising Regulator is a well-led and governed body that has the respect of the sector, public and government. And in that time, I think we've established a mature complaints and investigations function. We've set up a viable registration scheme. We've developed key policies and guidance for the fundraising sector. We've operated a tailored inquiries service. And we've also launched a public directory and the fundraising badge that helps members of the public make an informed donation decision. We have a sustainable independent funding model through the levy and registration arrangements. So the larger charities pay pro rata in respect of the amount of money they spend on fundraising. And I think we have proved that self-regulation of fundraising works. I hope there'll be an opportunity today to reflect on the impact we've had over the past 5 years. And also, I'm going to ask Gerald to set out our plans for the year ahead. But I'm going to stop now, partly because I have to leave the call in a couple of minutes and hand over to Gerald. So over to you, Gerald.
Thanks, Toby, and good afternoon to everyone. It's really good to be here again. I'm going to take a very quick look ahead, having had reflections from Toby on our first 5 years, and it really doesn't seem like that since we were set up in early 2016. But after that 5-year period, one of the key things we're doing at the moment is working up, ready to launch a new strategic plan for 5 years from September 2022. And that's going to set out our regulatory objectives and priorities for the years ahead, with a particular focus on developing our proactive regulatory model, regulating intelligently, and as Helen was saying earlier, using data to support the development of the Code of Fundraising Practice and our compliance-led work. We will be collaborating, as we've always done, with the charity sector to ensure that our regulation is proportionate and targeted, and we'll keep abreast of technological advances and how that's going to shape the future of fundraising. We know from our experience and engagement during the long months of lockdown that many charities really ramped up their fundraising online, and there are all sorts of new digital approaches coming through that we need to keep abreast of as an intelligence-led regulator. So we'll be engaging with key stakeholders during 2022 ahead of the 1st of September launch of the new plan next year. A few other highlights, looking as well at the Code of Fundraising Practice, which is the core document that we use in our work. It sets the standards that apply to all charitable fundraising organisations right across the 4 countries of the UK, and it applies whether or not an organisation pays the levy or otherwise registered with us. As you may remember, we modernised the code extensively in 2019. So later in 2022, probably late summer, autumn, we'll be reviewing what the status of the code is and where we may need to make some changes, perhaps in particular around digital fundraising and the increasing use of online fundraising platforms to raise money. One thing we do want to do is preserve the success of the current version of the code, which has a plain English crystal mark for its transparency. And we know that the online code off our website receives over 200,000 visits a year. So there'll be a review of the code, and we'll be talking to colleagues in all 4 countries of the UK about that in the year ahead. As part of our pandemic response, as my fellow chief executives have just said, we supported organisations, but specifically to fundraise as best they could in very difficult circumstances. And that had to be in line with changing government advice through various phases of the pandemic, and also had to reflect what was going on in the 4 UK countries, which wasn't always the same. Many organisations engaged with us through our inquiries line to find out what was going on, and we know that the online guidance that we drafted in partnership with the Chartered Institute of Fundraising really met the needs from the feedback that we've had. We continue to monitor what's going on, and I should say here that I'm very grateful to officials at DCMS for helping us with the guidance and for brokering it through other colleagues in central government, whether at England and Wales level or those that operate across the UK, to make sure that what we were saying was correct. Turning now to one of the things we were asked to do when we were set up following the 2015 cross-party review, and that was to set up and operate a fundraising preference service to help members of the public who might not want to receive direct marketing from charities. To date, around 14,000 people have used the service, and over 2,000 charities in England and Wales and Northern Ireland will have received a request for a suppression of contact through the service. What we do know significantly is that around 1/3 of those people getting in touch with us are making a request for contact to stop on behalf of someone who is vulnerable. And that really is at the core of what the service is about. We've reviewed the service, and early in 2022, we'll be making some changes and improvements to it. And some good news, because we were rightly asked about the cost of the service. We've negotiated a new contract with the supplier, which will save us over £100,000 a year in running the service for the next 3 years. So the revisions coming through will be to make the service, give it improved functionality and to make it more user-friendly. Turning quickly to levy and registration, that's at the core of our fundraising as a voluntary regulator. Levy compliance has been really, really good this year and last year. We're still collecting the levy at the moment for the year beginning September the 1st, 2021. We've collected 91% of it so far from 1,750 charities. We're about 10% ahead of where we were a year ago, and we thought we were doing extremely well in difficult circumstances then. But I think that shows the recognition that charities have about the value we can add to their fundraising and the way we seek to do it. The levy seeks to raise about £2.1 million a year, and that's about 0.1% of overall fundraising expenditure by charities. In addition to that, we now have over 3,000 charities outside the levy registered with us for a small annual fee, as well as nearly 160 commercial organisations, those that work in partnership with charities. Our casework continues to increase. During the 2021 financial year, we had 1,035 incoming complaints, and roughly a third of those were directly within our remit. The others were either at too early a stage to come to us, in that the complainant hadn't yet sought resolution from the charity concerned, or were for another regulator. So there's quite a bit of trade between us and the Charity Commission over that, because we sometimes get more general governance inquiries, which would be more appropriately handled by the Commission. The casework function has matured since we set up. We're much more careful about when we investigate, and we sometimes get criticism in social media that we're not doing enough investigations. I think you need to be careful what you wish for there. But the investigations we do are very, very much more complex than they were 4 and 5 years ago. We're looking to improve the way we do casework, so I hope there'll be some changes to that during 2022 and into 23 as we bring about some improvements, and also make our regulation and compliance work much more outward facing, working jointly with charities. And finally, before I stop, ahead of the new strategic plan, we've also launched our equality, diversity and inclusion strategy to make sure that as a regulator, we're accessible to all who need to be in touch with us, and that we respond in a way that is open and transparent. Thanks, Jill.
Thank you very much, Gerald. And I think an enormous amount of progress and experience during the 5 years of your existence. Now we're going to move to questions and answers, and just a couple of points. First of all, to remember that our regulators are not able to answer questions on any individual cases. That wouldn't be appropriate for them. And the second convention that we follow is that parliamentarians get first go at the questions. So if any of my parliamentary colleagues have questions, if they could get Chris's attention or somebody's attention, mine, put a hand up or whatever, and we'll take your questions first.
Jill, just to say, I think actually what we're going to do is Janella's going to bring forward the parliamentarians who are here as panelists. So it'll be a bit easier for them to come in if they want to.
Okay, fine. So again, I ask my parliamentary colleagues to come forward with their questions. I can't believe parliamentarians don't have any questions, or at least comments that they would like to make to the 3 excellent presentations, well, 4 excellent presentations that we've had. And I see Lord Hodgson has his hand up. Can somebody let Robin in?
Am I visible? Am I audible?
Yes, we can see you, Robin. I can't. Well, I can hear you. I can't quite see you at the moment.
Well, don't worry about that. What I wanted to ask the regulators was about the underperforming tail of the charity sector. There are an awful lot of charities that aren't doing anything bad, but not doing anything very much, and they are sitting often. Press that button. They're very often sitting on quite substantial amounts of money, which could usefully be deployed in more up-to-date ways. I mean, I think we know about the CPRE rules for the Charity Commission and how they can do that as charities are closed down. But is there a role to try and find a way to make sure that charities have a sort of MOT test from time to time, that they are still performing a useful function? After all, they do get tax breaks from the taxpayer and so on. And I think there may be a role here for regulators to do a bit more chivying up. I'm not quite sure what the right word is, but certainly keeping the charity sector fresh and thinking about the deadwood.
And perhaps I was interested in something Maureen said about helping charities come to terms with when their job was finished, as it were, and they could think about winding up. Let me come to you first on that one, Maureen, if I may, and then I'll ask all the other panelists to comment on Lord Hodgson's question.
Thank you. Super question, and something that I think is on all of our minds. So yes, we're working with an organisation called Foundation Scotland currently on finding those sleepy charities, whatever we've all variously called them, and not quite chivying them along, but actually just contacting them to find out why on earth they are being so quiet and what needs to be done. And what's really helpful about that work is that we really are helping people to come to terms with the fact that nobody wants to be sitting quietly. And I think there was a reasonable amount of guilt sitting with a lot of people about what sitting on this money and so on. So some actually saying already, yes, it's time for us to wind up. Some saying we just weren't really sure what to do next in terms of progress. So we're putting them in touch with third sector interfaces and so on. We're doing this work, and I'm going to try not to steal Helen's thunder, because they actually started it first, and we're saying that was a jolly good idea. So we're now coming in on the back of that. But certainly from my perspective, I do think it's really, really important to enable people to know that there's a safe space to say our time is done with this. And we've just come to the end of a much more awkward situation on the other side, where organisations who sat there for far too long on money, and that we then had to actually go in, appoint a judicial factor, go through processes to get that money moved back into being spent in that area for those purposes. That's a crying shame. I don't mind doing the tough work and the awkward work. I'd much rather enable people to do the right thing at the right point.
Thank you very much. And Helen, your perspective on this, please.
Yes, I mean, absolutely. So this for us is a programme called Revitalizing Trusts, and we've been, I think, undertaking this now for about 3 years. And basically we work to identify charities that are dormant, that don't seem to have had any activity or spent any money over the last whatever period. And then we'll contact the trustees, and we'll try and help them rejuvenate themselves, perhaps rewrite their objectives, or rejuvenate their activity if they want to. But if they don't want to, we'll help them close up, and we'll move their money into an area where that money can be used, or their assets can be used to fulfill the charitable purpose that was set up. Now, that's resulted, I think, in about 50 million, upwards of 50 million pounds going back into the sector to rejuvenate it, and we've got about 21 already million target this year. So I'm really pleased with that. I think it's a positive way for the regulator to engage with the charity sector and try and either rejuvenate those organisations or help them to wind up and move their money into into being actively used communities. And of course, we really do need to see that money released now for communities that are working really hard to kind of deal with the impact, if you like, of the pandemic. So I think that I'm really pleased to see that OSCR are doing that too. We're obviously doing it in England, and now we've started to do this in Wales as well. So really positive, I hope, intervention by the regulators.
Thank you. And Gerald, it would be a slightly different take on this for you, but is there anything you'd like to add on this one?
Yes, it is very obviously a different approach for us, because our concern is with those charities that are actively fundraising and using the money they raise for the purpose that they say they raise it for, whether that's a restricted project or for general use, as Maureen was referring to earlier. One of our encouragements to charities is to report on what they're fundraising. There are, for English and Welsh charities, provisions in the 2016 charities legislation to require a fundraising charity to report on key factors in its fundraising, and we'll be doing another survey next year to see how that reporting compliance is going, because it's developing. It'll be about the third or fourth year that it's required, and compliance needs to be a bit better on that in the interests of transparency.
So some good news for you, Lord Hodgson, there. Is that okay for you? Thank you. I have two more parliamentarians waiting. First is Baroness Barker. Please come in, Liz.
Hi, thank you very much, everybody. I'm listening carefully to what you've all been saying about the need to keep up with digital change. I've been wondering for some time whether we need to reassess what we consider to be a charity. And I would go back a stage further and say, I think we need to understand what is an organisation these days, because I see campaign groups call themselves an organisation, but for a long time all they are is a Facebook page and possibly some crowdfunding. And I rather wonder whether, as some of them develop and grow and go on to become charities, whether they will fulfill what we would have in the past demanded of a charity in terms of transparency about how they do things and what they do. So I rather, it's almost like a philosophical point about what in the digital age constitutes a charity, and are there ways in which charity law perhaps has to be updated in order to take into account the ways in which people now do their business.
Thank you very much. Certainly a fundamental question, Liz, if not a philosophical one. I'll come to you first, Helen, on this one.
Yeah, and I think Baroness Barker makes a really important point, and particularly one that was evidenced, I think, during the pandemic, where we saw groups of people set up quite quickly to respond to a need, and perhaps organise around some fundraising or some activity. And they may or may not have then gone on to register as a charity. I think it's how do we incentivize and keep as a society the kind of good stuff that people are trying to do, whilst remaining the kind of bar, if you like, to becoming a registered organisation with all the responsibilities that brings, but as well with the benefits that it brings. How do we ensure that that's rightly balanced? And obviously Parliament will have a view on that, and all of us will regulate within that framework. But I think it is an important change that we are seeing in the way in which people perhaps want to express their desire to help their neighbour or to help their community. And it's whether or not the regulatory framework as it's set up now actually enables people to do that without forcing them into a registered charity remit. Because we know that actually the bar to becoming a registered charity is rightly a kind of significant one because of the benefits that it brings, but also the kind of the way in which it represents for the public a kind of almost like a a seal, if you like, of approval once you get the registered status. So I don't have any wonderful answers as to the right step forward, but I recognise it is an emerging issue for the way in which people in society are responding to need at this stage.
Thank you very much. And it occurs to me it's something perhaps the all-party group could look at, some of this fundamental question about what constitutes a charity and is that changing. Maureen, over to you.
Thank you. And this is a good one to go second on. That gave me a few minutes thinking time. And I think it is a great question and something that does cause confusion for the public. There is no doubt. If we look at the most upsetting concerns and inquiries that we get when people realise that they're asking us about an organisation that they think sounds like a charity, looks like a charity, we're saying, well, that's not a charity, it's nothing to do with us. That's something that we deal with very, very regularly, and I'm sure other colleagues are the same. And I can see Gerald nodding, and that's quite often where we'll hand some aspects over to each other, and so on and so forth. It's the other end of the spectrum as well that can cause upset and aggravation for the public. And I'm looking at our great list of the breadth of charitable organisations out there who are registered. So everything from church-based organisations to universities and colleges to a whole range and breadth of organisations that people are thinking, gosh, I didn't know that was a charity. Why is that charity? Or why is that not? And I think there is something fundamental in all of our purposes about really trying to enable the public to truly understand what charities are and to help them to find it less boring to look at what the purposes are. And when we're saying, did you look at the purposes? They're saying, why would I do that? If I was going to give money, I just give it because I give it. So there is something I think that sits as a responsibility for the regulators and for other wider organisations. I'm looking at Chris from NCVO and thinking there are lots of us sitting with a collective responsibility to do that, but it is a question that I would welcome people having a consideration of.
What's your take on this, Gerald?
Well, Baroness Barker's asked such an important question for us at the moment. With the increase in people wanting to campaign on issues that are very close to their heart, they raise money, as Baroness Barker was saying, on fundraising platforms, and we get quite a number of complaints. It's growing all the time, where people have a different view about the campaign concerned. And for us, we're not quite as tightly constrained as colleagues at the Commission and OSCR, because charitable for us can extend into organizations that have a charity with a small c, if you like, philanthropic and benevolent, as the lawyers might describe them, rather than being a registered charity. And sometimes trying to find where that fuzzy line is between something that is broadly defined as for public benefit, but then the other side is that it's actually a fairly closed, self-interested group of people, is very, very difficult to find. And it's territory that's largely unregulated. And I'd be very keen to share experience with colleagues on that, because it's becoming a much, much bigger problem than it was. And it makes a number of people quite angry sometimes, for understandable reasons, that there isn't a way of getting their concern aired. We had someone complaining about a campaign that had been launched on a crowdfunding platform in order to raise money to take a case to the Supreme Court. And the individual felt there wasn't a hope in hell of that happening, and therefore it was fundraising for a purpose that could never be fulfilled. But nothing we could do, because it was a campaign, it wasn't remotely charitable. So there are gaps and new frontiers opening up here.
Thank you very much for such a significant question, Liz, Baroness Barker, and perhaps we can take some opinions from other participants in this webinar afterwards. But first I'm going to take another parliamentarian, Fleur Anderson. What's your question?
Thank you very much, Baroness Keighley, and thank you very much for chairing, and thanks to Chris also for organising the meeting, and to all the regulators for all the work you do of this really, really difficult time, especially of supporting charities and also enabling that public trust in charities, which is so important and so hard to regain when lost. as well. I've got a couple of comments and a question. My first comment is actually leading on from the discussion we've just had, which is about the elections bill and the effect that this will have as well. It's another layer that's coming in. I've been on the elections bill committee, so I know very much about the inside of it, and I was sharing quite a lot there about the potential impact on charities of the elections bill, because it has a whole clause and a whole section on third-party campaigning. And if any campaign joins with another campaign, there'll be a lot more requirement to be registering all the spending within that. So it will potentially have that chilling effect that the 2005 charities bill had of charities unable to really work out entirely if they fall within or without the law, and so not doing things because just in case it would be coming within the law, and so therefore dampening down work that they would do altogether. And that's what I'm concerned about within that. So just a warning that that's coming. We don't know when it will be coming back for its third reading, and there will be amendments to Parliament. What I wanted to ask was really about long-term funding, and Maureen, you mentioned that need for the long-term funding for the organisation that charities need, and I, having worked in charities, I'd absolutely echo that. And needed more than ever as funds were used up during COVID. Those last funds were used up that may cushion charities and about how they work going forward. But my comment was about really connected with a charity that I visited this morning in my constituency, and what one of the biggest issues is finding community buildings. And so the link between funding and having buildings, and the link between the planning laws changing, between that funding of councils enabling charities to use a building, and the changing role of the high street as well, and the role that charities can play with that. Because I can see that as we go more online for shopping for some things, our shops in the high street, everyone wants them to be filled, but they'll be filled much more with local charities, with community uses, and that's to be absolutely welcomed. But there needs to be some freeing up of the rules and regulations that allow that, and sometimes they can get in the way. So my question is about, are there regulations that can get in the way? Are there planning laws? Could there be changes which would enable charities to be able to use those buildings that are otherwise standing empty in our communities and on our high streets? So the one I went to this morning was a shed for men in sheds project run by Age UK Wandsworth. Fantastic. It used to be a Chinese takeaway. Otherwise, they closed down during COVID, and otherwise it would have just been left an eyesore on a little local high street. But instead, it's been totally repurposed, and it's a great place for men and women to come down to and make fantastic things in our community. So the council have enabled that to happen, but in other places I know they haven't allowed that to happen. It's been a lot of red tape and difficulty in getting that. So just a question about whether that's possible. Maybe it could also be a future, something we talk about in the APPG in the future as well. Thanks.
Thank you very much indeed for that question, Fleur. And I'll come to you first, Gerald, before I go to the two other regulators, to see if you've got experience of these difficulties which Fleur mentions.
Not absolutely directly in the sense she's outlined, but clearly if a charity is going to take on a shop front and there are costs associated with that, then they're going to have to very self-evidently cover those costs and raise money to do that if they don't have the resources. And I think whilst I would absolutely want to encourage charities to be able to do that and encourage local authorities to help them do that, and indeed other landowners who might be able to help. Again, charities need to be cautious about doing that and be sure that they can actually take on the project or at least have a good stab at fundraising for it in line with the code and good standards of practice to make it happen. So I'd be broadly supportive and want to see good practice in fundraising to bring that about.
And Maureen, I'm aware that the planning restrictions and things may be slightly different in Scotland. So if you could give us your take on it.
Yeah, I think absolutely. I was thinking about that as I was listening. There will be the variability part will be very similar, however, although the planning regulations are very different, and not something that we are specifically coming across at the moment. We are hearing some great examples of a lot of people giving up their buildings, their prestigious buildings in Edinburgh particularly seem to be coming up for sale, that a lot of charities have been sitting in for a long time, and they're freeing up those assets and moving into various shopping centres and so on. So I certainly think what you were seeing is something that we are likely to see, and certainly it's something that we take the opportunity to try to be proactive. So we do go along to meet the meet both the officials and the elected members from local government to really help to share our data again and the opportunities that working with charities presents. So I think what we can do in this space as well, we haven't got the access to the detail of persuading people about particular legislation. We can actually show the impact that that joint work can have and encourage and enable it.
Thank you. And Helen from
yeah, first of all, a bit of a digression, but I know the charity Men in Sheds, and to me that's just if we ever look at why we think the charity sector is important, I think that the way in which that charity is actually dealing, I think, with kind of getting men to talk and mental health issues, it's a brilliant example of how what the charity sector does so well is kind of look at an individual or a person as that individual and rather than an issue or a problem. And so the fact that you know get men into sheds and start talking and then building up mental health, I think is a really brilliant example of how the charity sector is often able to think outside of the box in a way that sometimes the public sector isn't able to do. So great example of that. I think as well, I mean, I haven't got an in-depth understanding of planning law. I know that actually what this illustrates is the fact that many charities are actually coming into, because they're not dealing just in one particular issue, they're coming into contact with a number of kind of rules, regulations from different parts, from different regulators or different local authorities, which makes it quite a very complex landscape for charities to sometimes negotiate. And you know, I can understand if they sometimes give up because it can seem so difficult. So certainly from us as a perspective from the regulator in England and Wales, we haven't seen this emerging through our risk issues as a massive issue, but if there are instances of it occurring and there's things that we can do to engage with the department responsible for planning, then obviously very happy to do so. But I think it illustrates some of the challenges that charities face when they're trying to deliver on behalf of their beneficiaries.
And also the link between commercial activity and charitable activity, which is another thing that we've constantly trying to tease out. Now I see that Baroness Barker and Lord Hodgson want to come back, so over to you, Liz. You're muted.
Yeah, okay, got it. It's just one other issue that I want to flag up. Somebody has raised with me the fact that Virgin have pulled out of the fundraising, charity fundraising space, means that we are now left in a situation where there are, in effect, only two organisations operating. One is the one that's run by Chester Moj Sinclair, the small group. It's now Enthuse. But by far the biggest one is Just Giving, and Just Giving, as we know, is owned by Blackboard. And Just Giving is has a policy of tying people up into exclusive deals, and I am rather concerned about the potential for us for us to be left with only one fundraising platform, and I wonder whether at some stage we might look at that in some detail, because I think that is not a healthy situation for our sector.
That's a very specific comment for you, Gerald. I'm not sure if you're able to comment on it, but please take the opportunity if you can.
Yes, I can. We've been working with platforms for a while. There are actually quite a lot more platforms than just the two Baroness Barker mentioned, and I'm certainly aware that when Virgin announced that their platform was closing at the end of November, there was quite a lot of competition to try and get charities that had used that platform to sign up to others, whether Just Giving, GoFundMe, Crowdfunder, or a multiplicity of much smaller ones. So there is a there is a sort of infrastructure out there. It goes beyond the two that Baroness Barker mentioned, although Just Giving is far and away the largest and the one that everyone knows.
And Gerald, it insists on an exclusivity deal in its terms.
I would say that charities need to think very carefully about whether they want to enter into an arrangement like that. If they sign up to Just Giving, it's their choice, and they need to view that in that way. But we are engaging quite actively at the moment with platforms, again, after a period through the lockdown where that was more difficult. So I'd be happy to take that issue into those discussions, and indeed to talk to you outside the meeting, if helpful, about all that.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gerald. And Robin, you wanted to come back, I think, Lord Hodgson?
Yes, I just wanted to, I don't want to rain on the parade, and absolutely I understand about the need for space and places for people to meet. We discussed it extensively in the dormant asset bills, community wealth funds and so on, so I get that. What I'm slightly concerned about is retail activities from charities on the high street, because they have tax breaks. And they now, of course, have got bigger tax breaks because they're doing agency sales, and therefore they get gift aid on their transactions. That we are in danger of actually undermining other retailers who are having to provide similar services with a full freight. And I'm not against charities doing it, but I do think moving to gift aid reclaiming was probably not what was originally thought of in terms of setting up a shop. And I do think we need to make sure we don't make the situation on high streets worse in an effort to try and find ways that charities could operate in the high street. Just a word of caution more than anything else. But I quite understand about men in sheds. That seems to be an entirely sensible thing to be doing.
Thank you, Robin. Do any of our panelists want to comment on what Robin said? It was what I really vaguely referred to when I talked about the commercial activities. In Ross-on-Wye, where I live, every other shop on the high street is a charity and claiming gift aid, obviously. Does anyone any of our panelists want to comment on that? Or you'd be happy to leave it alone. I understand that, but thank you, Robin. And thank you to our parliamentarians for their contributions. And we now can open it up to anybody else who'd like to ask a question or make a comment. I think I've got one question from Nick Burton, who's already put it in. Is he there and able to do it? Or somebody else got Nick's question?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Yes, go ahead.
So the question was for Helen Stevenson. The effective principal regulators who are required for exempt charities, there's an anomaly in the legislation. If you don't have a principal regulator, which applies to all mutual societies, which have potentially 10 million members, then the Charity Commission's powers are restricted to less than those than if there is a principal regulator. In other words, when you've got less regulation, you've got less power, which makes no sense. The effect of that in particular is that they cannot launch a statutory inquiry, and if they can't do that, that very much restricts their ability to do much else. My question, I don't imagine it's going to get a comprehensive answer now, is what the Charity Commission's view is on that, and what, if anything, they propose to do about it. It's been sitting on the Charity Minister's desk for at least the best part of 2 years now.
I'm not sure if you're able to comment on that, Helen. Did you get the sense of Nick's question? It did go in and out slightly, but your sound was slightly interrupted, Nick.
Yes,
it's on the Q&A if that's easier.
Yes, and certainly it's. I think you're talking, and I haven't got the detail to hand, Nick, so I won't be able to answer the question in detail. So I will try and get back to you after this session with a more comprehensive answer. But I understand it's to do with some of the anomalies in the way that charity law is structured in this country, which does leave some organisations without the kind of principal regulator that we're aware of, that some of them other exempt charities do. But if I can't answer it directly, I'll obviously find from my colleagues in DCMS their views on that, and it can come back to you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That's very helpful.
Thank you, Nick, for your question. Other questions from participants? I have one I'd like to put to participants and see if anyone responds to it, because I was very, very struck by Helen's figures right at the beginning about 70% of charities having to pause their activities at the beginning of the lockdown, but also that charities have become among the most trusted institutions. And I wondered what the experience of participants was about the reaction of the public to them. And I know very much, certainly in the health and social care field, charities were actually the only people operating at the beginning of the lockdown because so many public services actually weren't able to operate. So I wonder if anyone would like to volunteer their experience of trust in charities during the pandemic. Now, if I were in the room with you, I would target somebody, you see, but I can't actually do that here. I think, okay, well, I'll ask Helen then to say a little bit more about the review of the data that she mentioned. She said that more work was going on, and I think we've all been more aware of how data is used and how it's accessed during the pandemic. And I must say that the flexibility of some people about access to their data has been very impressive, whereas the reluctance of some to share data, which might have been helpful, has also been something to be concerned about. So can you tell us a bit more about the work you're going to be doing on that, Helen?
Yeah, I mean, it's been long held an ambition of mine to make sure that our data, which is the most comprehensive data about charities in England and Wales, is used as fully as it can be, both for the public to kind of to see what about charities that they want to support, but also for policymakers and the sector itself to understand the picture of the charity sector in England and Wales more fully. So we've now made the technical changes that we needed to do to the register to ensure that it's far more searchable. There's data that's displayed about charities, and once we've been able to do that, I think the next step for me was making sure that the data we collect is collected in the best format to be most usable for people to understand, you know, more about this hugely important sector in our society. And at the moment, the way that the things that we collect, both as register particulars and then in the annual report and accounts, don't necessarily give us all the information that would be helpful in terms of understanding more about the charity sector. And I think actually the pandemic highlighted this. It was quite difficult for people who were trying to create the argument for more investment into the charity sector at the time to really understand the scale and the impact based on data of what we were seeing coming into the charity sector. So it's long been an ambition of mine to make sure that our data is used as effectively as possible, and that I think has been consolidated by our experiences over the pandemic, where it was not always easy to really demonstrate the impact that COVID could be having into the charity sector. So it's relatively, you know, although it'll be quite a big project for us, because of course it will necessarily impact into the, you know, the thousands of charities that report to us, but I think an important one if we are to really understand the charity sector in England and Wales and ensure that that data and information is used as fully and as effectively as possible.
Thank you. And I know you have a concern about this, Baroness Barker, and I'll come back to you. But if, Maureen, I was struck when you talked to us, it was about the people who were not digitally enabled, you know, the people who were perhaps locked out of some of that data sharing and how you dealt with that.
Yeah. it's one of these things. Of course, it's helpful if we can move digitally, if we can use more AI, if we can streamline and have efficiencies, then we can use our limited pot to do other things. And I think so many public services are going that way. But our reality check of that is in recognizing that there are, just for so many different reasons, an awful lot of people who either decide not to access or just don't have digital access, don't have that interest in that, but still are involved in a lot of charities. So I think it is about always making sure that we're not just assuming everybody can. At one point, there was a strong encouragement that everything just should be put that way, so that people would have to follow. And yet we know that there's a high percentage of people, or a significant percentage of people who can't do that. So for us, it's always about making sure that we're talking to the rest of those colleagues out there who do have that access through intermediary bodies and so on. So it's always about making sure that we've got other offers there, that we keep ourselves on our phone lines. So again, there was a strong interest in would we get rid of the phone lines, because actually everybody can access all the guidance and so on online, and they can just send us an online form. Well, there's a lot of people who don't want to do that. So it's about the balance of that and just making sure that anybody from the public and anybody from a charity can find us if they need to.
Mm-hmm. And Baroness Barker, did you want to comment on that as well?
I just wanted to ask a question. I understand about people who are not included in the digital world, but increasingly people are. And I've often thought that the most effective thing for a charity of any size to do is to have, if they can't do a website, is to have a Facebook page, and on that 2 bits of information, their governing document and their annual report and accounts, and then then anybody can go in and make the judgments that they have to do. But I specifically want to ask about the Charity Commission and the changes to the register. I'm somebody who spends many a happy hour going through the register to find stuff. Am I right that you are now no longer putting up the full governing document of any charity on there? Because I think that is quite a significant loss of information for anybody who wants to see whether a charity is actually fulfilling its all its obligations.
Helen, particularly for you.
We don't put the governing documents on, partly because they often contain personal information about trustees. And so people apply to us to ask for their governing documents, and we have to redact the personal information before we can send it out, which of course has got a huge implication for us as well at the Commission. Now that has since changed. A lot of charities don't have names and addresses of trustees on their governing documents. So we are working to actually publish the governing documents alongside the charity register. There's a few that are still very old charities that often have names and addresses on their governing documents, which will be difficult, but actually we're moving to try and make sure that those governing documents are available for the public, and also very often for the organisations themselves who may have lost their governing documents and apply to us to try and get them, find them again. So definitely that's something we want to do, Baroness Barker, to make it more accessible and easy for people to see, and also then to make it easier for charities themselves actually.
Thank you.
Thank you. I have a comment here from Beverly Ratcliffe, who says she can't come off mute to be able to comment, but this is a very interesting and indeed even moving example of how charities reacted during the pandemic. She says, our charity, the Coroner's Court Support Service, became part of the pandemic multi-agency response team in London during the initial lockdown, and were the first point of contact for families whose family member had died at home of suspected COVID. And we were able to inform them of which temporary morgue their loved one had been taken. And I think that does remind you of the huge gap there was at the beginning about the information people had and how they could access, and the importance of the charitable sector in being able to perform what is quite a simple and actually very tragic function, but of huge importance to people who had lost a loved one at that time. And I think that relates to the way in which we've all used data and digital engagement during this time. I have actually sadly lost count of the number of online funerals I've attended, something to which I would never have dreamt in the past. So that's another example of how we were, as it were, forced into different kinds of engagement. Now, have I anybody else who would like to ask a question or make a comment to our excellent panelists? And if not, and I can't see anybody, I'm going to thank them, to thank Gerald and Helen and Maureen and Toby in his absence for their presentations, for their excellent answers to our question, and also to thank NCVO and all colleagues there who are always such excellent facilitators. Robin, have you put your hand up again?
No.
Oh, right, okay.
Sorry, I'm just taking it down, sorry.
Sorry, Joe, there was another question that came in I think just before you were about, you started finishing off from Chloe Stables.
Chloe, where are you?
Chanel.
Chloe, are you there?
Oh, hello, can you hear me?
Yes, Chloe, go ahead.
Oh, hi. I won't put my camera on. I've got a real horrid cold and I look dreadful. But yes, I just wanted to kind of ask a bigger question really, which was about, you know, the resilience of charities in the kind of the short to medium future and what we can be doing to kind of support them. You know, obviously we're going to have, you know, some of the specific kind of COVID support measures, you know, some of will have finished already, but some of the kind of the loans and kind of support and things like that will be tailing off over the next year. You know, we've had the interesting research from the Charity Commission about how reserves are changing and how, you know, fewer charities now have kind of reserves to rely on, particularly smaller ones. And so it was just a question really about, you know, kind of thinking about what we can do to support the future resilience really of charities and particularly the smaller ones.
Thank you very much for that, Chloe, and wish you better from a cold. I'll ask each of the panelists to comment on that and make it also, as it were, their closing comments for the meeting. And I'll come to you first, Gerald.
I think the thing that we are trying to do most is to make sure our guidance is accessible, that charities understand good practice when it comes to fundraising in order to support that resilience. It's you know, whether you're a large charity having to raise a lot of money to meet your obligations and to deliver the projects you want to do, or a smaller local charity, the same rules apply. We want to make sure they're as accessible and as friendly in their approach as we can. And that's very much the spirit, I think, in which we view the development of our new strategic plan from next year, and to encouraging charities to use our badge as a mark of their commitment to good fundraising, to support what they do and encourage their supporters to support them even more than they do already.
Thank you very much indeed, Gerald. And Maureen, the resilience question from Scotland.
I think there's 2 points to build on a lot of what Gerald was saying. That I think we want to make sure that there is evidence-based decision making using the data. I think that's something that's come through loud and clear in this whole discussion. So anything that's actually being done to and for and with the sectors needs to actually make sure that it's evidence-based and it's not just listening to those loudest voices. My concern is often that those who shout loudest are not often reflective of the breadth and requirements and needs of charities. I think the second point that we would make is that there's no doubt that you ask a busy person and they're normally not involved in just one charity, but 3 or 4. The amount of additionality of burnout for those involved in charities and who are charity trustees is probably higher than most of the rest of us. And I think we're recognizing that all of us are talking about the radical difference to our lives, the radical difference that's happened for trustees and the burden that they feel in looking after their communities, and the sense of frustration that they have and why they've been trying to do additional things does mean that we've got to make sure that we are giving a little bit of additional kindness there and additional thoughtfulness. And when people are getting things wrong, it's probably for a remarkably good reason.
Thank you very much. And the last word on this to you, Helen.
First, I want to pay tribute to the resilience of the charity sector, of the organisations that I've spoken to during the pandemic. At the beginning of the pandemic, I spoke to about 20 of the kind of biggest charities, just to check in on them, really, to see how they were doing, because I know that sudden drop in fundraising income and, with shops closing as well, was an incredible shock into the system. So I was really impressed with the steps those organisations were taking to ensure that their charities could stay on track. They were kind of redefining their strategies, sometimes pulling back from certain activities in order to make sure they came out of the pandemic in a more resilient place. That was also followed by a series of round tables with smaller charities that we're undertaking. In fact, I've got another one this afternoon. So, really impressed with the way in which many charities responded to the challenges. In terms of funding resilience, I think one of the things I've been keen to talk about to funders is to be really clear that they should be funding unrestricted funds as well as restricted funds in order for charities to build up their reserves again, and saying that that's a legitimate sort. They should be ensuring that's a legitimate thing to fund going forward. So really looking to funders to step up to the plate there to fund, building up of those unrestricted funds again for charities. And then just finally to touch on something that we've seen a lot of, and I don't know whether Maureen and Gerald are seeing this too, but actually resilience in terms of relationship. That some of the cracks and the difficulties that we've seen in the charity sector have not been about finance necessarily. They've been about stresses into the kind of the way in which an organisation is run, the governance, the trustees, the relationships between trustees, and that can be starting to manifest itself in terms of kind of regulatory issues. And so I would just call that out as an issue that we do need to see good, where good governance is in place, then those charities will be, I believe, resilient. And so we still need to do more to ensure that trustees are running their charities well and they have access to the tools and the guidance they need to be able to run those charities effectively. And that's something we at the Commission want to continue to do and do more of in the future.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much for all those excellent comments and very thoughtful comments and looking towards the future. And I'm sure we'll revisit some of these when we have what I hope will be an in-person meeting. I see I have one new message here, but I can't actually read. Oh, it's just to say, I think I do have to bring it to a close now because we're almost at the end of our time. But to resume my thanks to our panelists and to NCVO, and most of all to all the participants for taking part and listening to what I think has been a very, very helpful session. There is a live transcript available to you. So thank you very much indeed for your attendance and good morning. No, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.